Right, welcome everyone to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we are enjoying a talk from James Conroy-Finn. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 8,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-to-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events just like this one. If you're not a member of the CTO Craft community and are interested in becoming one, or if you'd like to get updates on these events via emails, I'll post some links in the chat to help you do that. Huge thanks to CTO Craft sponsor partners for making sure these Bytes events are possible. Partners like AWS, Google Cloud, O'Reilly, and Pentalog, amongst others. CTO Craft membership gives you access to some unique benefits from some of these partners, so click the links that will be in the chat to find out more. I'm Megan, and I'm the community manager at CTO Craft. Joining me today is James Conroy-Finn, scientist, technologist, coach, and consultant, and latest, if you saw the LinkedIn post, coach at CTO Craft. James, can you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely happy to. Hello, everyone. I think you did a pretty good job of summarizing things there, so thank you for the warm introduction. My background, way back when, hence the scientist, was physics, and spent about a decade in startups after that, and then a bunch of consulting with large companies, small companies, where I was exposed to various onboarding processes, some good, some bad, which we'll touch on a little bit during the talk today.
Brill. I will just post some links, and then I'll let you take it away. If you have any questions for James, please do put it in either the chat or the ask a question box, and James will get round to answering those towards the end of the session. Take it away, James.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me share my screen. Can you see a big blue box? Is that popping up? There you go. Awesome, we got it. Okay, so crafting excellent onboarding experiences. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'll get straight down to our central thesis for today's talk, and that is that excellent onboarding experiences, excellent onboarding processes will enable you to embrace change and remain relevant. So with that, I'd like to start with a brief history of onboarding, where we'll start to look at the shapes and sizes and dimensions that differentiate between the different types of experiences you may have encountered yourself and may be designing in the future. So this term onboarding, I've used this term onboarding already. You've probably heard the term onboarding. The word itself became popular in management circles in the 1970s. It was used to describe the training given to new employees to turn them into productive members of the workforce. That training usually consisted of an initial induction period, commonly categorized using 6 dimensions. The first dimension, collective or individual, differentiates based on the number of participants. In organizations onboarding tens or even hundreds of employees multiple times per year, assuming convergence of needs, it can make sense to batch those new joiners to reduce waste. A senior member of the team giving the same speech at regular intervals to a few hundred people is going to be less disruptive and therefore an easier sell. In smaller organizations, you may grow the entire company by single digits per year. If that's the case, asking your recently screened ninja or guru or messiah to wait 6 months for the next hire to come along is thoroughly impractical. You may have to bite the proverbial bullets and give that speech to one person twice a year. 1 second, I'm just going to pick this dog. Charlie, have a go, man. There you go. You can't be chewing that in here. Apologies. A benefit of the group onboarding is the opportunity for relationship building. If you have a large number of people, you can get them together. Relationships that can be built during those sessions can provide welcome support when joining a large organization. A friendly face in the corridor to share stories and experiences with. Someone essentially in the same boat as you. And while you can't form those relationships with your fellow newbies in an individualized onboarding experience, that experience can be tailored to the needs of the individual. It can be a much more bespoke and personalized experience. And There are ways which we might touch on later of socializing, of meeting colleagues, meeting peers, even if you aren't having those sort of hotel-based large onboarding induction type experiences. The second dimension, formal or informal, I like to refer to as separated or on the job. The focus here is on the environment where onboarding takes place. In some instances, inductees are invited to stay at a hotel or spend time in a meeting room away from the assumedly already productive. If certain facilities are necessary, river to cross to build a literal as well as metaphorical bridge, the office might not suit. Perhaps you have health and safety requirements where new joiners aren't allowed near hazardous machinery that necessitates people learning in a separate location. Whatever the motivation, the crux of learning in a special place rather than on the job is being removed from reality. While first aid training will adequately teach you to don your latex gloves and compress the chest to the beat of Staying Alive, it won't prepare you for the visceral experience of having to save someone's life with your bare hands. The third dimension, sequential or random, I think the name prescriptive or ambiguous is slightly more self-explanatory. Well understood requirements during an onboarding process can be quite prescriptive, a clear sequence of events or tasks laid out for someone to follow. In matters of compliance, with standardized procedures like prepping for surgery, a well-designed checklist can go a long way. Ambiguity, perhaps counterintuitively, can be desirable. A certain degree of autonomy and permission to explore, to demonstrate one's capabilities can be well received. Where the order in which tasks are completed is incidental, constraining individuals yields no benefits. The fourth dimension is time. Apologies, I had to get that in there. Or as the source of this model, Van Man and Shine called it fixed or variable. Deadlines are commonly introduced where safety and compliance are concerned, often mandated by external institutions ranging from auditors to lawyers, from customers to suppliers. In those instances, an email reminder to watch videos and answer multiple choice questions before the end of your first week or before engaging with clients isn't uncommon. I'm sure a number of us here will have experienced something like that working in larger organizations in the past. The fifth dimension, serial or disjunctive, differentiates processes where an experienced member of the team provides the training or where someone else, or perhaps no one at all, is made available to the team member. The examples of this you'll see in startups. You'll probably have an experienced member of the team available during onboarding. In smaller companies, that's quite common. In larger businesses, you may not experience that. But for our cases, I think we'll probably always be leaning towards having a mentor available, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The sixth dimension, excuse me, the sixth dimension, oh, sorry, that's the wrong slide, my bad. I've got a missing slide, technical difficulties. The sixth and final dimension, investiture and divestiture, refer to the degree to which individualities are recognized and championed during onboarding. This might not be something that you encounter. It probably won't come up in a startup type environment where you're optimizing for individuality, where you care about collaboration, idea exchange. These sorts of processes are more commonly found in military, say, onboarding experiences, in certain corporate structures where individual personality isn't welcome and you want people to wear a uniform and toe the party line and represent the corporate ideology in their everyday actions. So these six dimensions were attempted later to be simplified by a chap named Gareth Jones. This is back in the 80s, so this is quite old work. Jones suggested that there were two broad categories of onboarding. His idea was that instead of having these six categories, really we had just two, institutionalized and individualized. The former consisted of step-by-step programs delivered to groups by mentors, and the latter, where an individual would start work immediately and be expected to integrate themselves with little support from others. The reason I bring this up, I don't find either of those approaches particularly innovative. I introduce the terminology because I think it's useful to start thinking about what makes for excellent onboarding processes, which is what we're really here to talk about. For us to do so, I think we need to start considering the institutions and probably more importantly, the individuals involved. So excellence, what makes for an excellent onboarding process? Well, unfortunately, the answer is it depends. As we've seen, there are a number of dimensions and a great degree of variability dependent on the organization we're trying to scale. Onboarding processes are bespoke and need to be designed taking into account the needs of the institution and the individual. Fundamentally, an onboarding process is about socialization. And by that, I mean the process of learning to behave in an acceptable way, not having beers with a friend, right? Not socializing, actual socialization. We're attempting to teach an individual how to flourish within an existing group with its own culture, its own language, hierarchies, and probably idiosyncrasies. So let's get started. Where do we begin? My approach to creating an onboarding process is to start by defining success. And one method for doing so can be found within appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry enables one to establish a shared sense of purpose across seemingly incompatible institutions. They've used this to bring together different religious groups, to have them come together and combine efforts in ways that probably would be impossible without essentially focusing on their shared strengths and shared interests. Part of the process for delivering that is conducting interviews, asking people to imagine things like you've gone to sleep for a protracted period of time and you wake up. When you wake up from this long speech, you're on stage receiving an award on behalf of your company. What is the award for? What are people saying about your business? What was the impact? Who were the people that you reached? Amazon do something similar to this, where teams that are designing a new product or service will start by drafting a press release, drafting the announcement that will go out once they've completed their task. And in that press release, they may talk about how many customers they tested this feature with, how many problems they solved. They'll mention external partners, awards, and other aspirations. I've used this approach, this sort of goal-oriented approach in a number of ways with a number of teams in the past and found that it works very well. So for an onboarding process, when we do this, I think the questions you start to ask yourself are things like, what does a successfully onboarded individual look like? What should they be able to do? What information should they have? Who should they have met? What capabilities do they need to be productive? If one feels connected to their peers and productive in some meaningful way, they'll be happy within their tribe. So I'd like to look at a case study where I think we accomplished that. I certainly had feedback to indicate that we did from at least a couple of people. And this was one of my past companies. So let me set the scene a little. This company was a relatively small startup using technology. So a special case, as I mentioned earlier, bespoke processes. If you're in a similar situation with a similar type of company, this might be useful to you. If you're in a much larger company, then maybe we have a conversation later about some of the other dimensions that might make sense for your process. I chose an individualized process. It fit in very well with what we were trying to do at the company. What that meant was new joiners learned on the job with a mixture of sequential and random steps to complete. There was a deadline, but that was more a measure of my success rather than the inductees. It was a stretch goal for me to say that I've done a good job and that I'm onboarding people effectively. The socialization process was serial rather than disjunctive. I was available in Slack to answer any questions that came up, and I booked in regular check-ins during that first week to make sure that we were progressing things together and any blockers were being eliminated. We combined aspects of both investiture and divestiture. I know I said earlier that you're probably not looking to craft soldiers like the military might be, but I was keen on recognizing individual strengths, incorporating ideas, but also had some non-negotiables. So at the time, I wasn't willing to budge on certain engineering culture, things like automated testing for code that wasn't throwaway. That was a non-negotiable. We could have a conversation about it, but it was not the time and place during that first week to debate whether you should add a couple of tests to a code base if you were going to complete a feature. I chose a single overarching goal, which I've alluded to. The accomplishment, the idea was that by achieving this in your first week, you would demonstrate your value and your ability specific to the role that you were providing. So it should be rewarding, it should be fulfilling, it should be meaningful, and ideally require a lot of the touch points, a lot of the expectations of the real everyday experience this person's going to be getting stuck into, hopefully in their second week. So what was the goal? You could probably guess. It was about shipping something. For the engineers, of course, shipping is what we're all about. It's a large part of what we do. We want to put out changes, we want to learn. So the goal that we set was to deploy something to production within that first week. Doing so required access to various systems, familiarity with our tech stack, and frankly, a lot more that I didn't initially fully appreciate. I mapped out the end-to-end process of going from zero to production. I did so by jotting everything down in a Google Doc, and then I followed the process myself and noticed there were a number of blanks, a number of things I hadn't considered, certain tools maybe that were already installed on my computer that wouldn't be on a brand new laptop. So I filled in those blanks as I found them and did my best to get to a point where I had a full cohesive representation of exactly what you would need to do to get from that zero to that point of production. I won't lie, it definitely took some work to get that right. It was something that we iterated on and improved. I think we did a pretty good job of it the first time. But this is something that you need to continuously improve, continuously review. The results were specific to my organization, another caveat, and frankly, even to my team. You're not going to expect somebody to ship to production if they're not writing code. And even for junior engineers, it might be unrealistic if they're not familiar with some of the tech stack to set that kind of expectation. So it very much made sense with the people that I was hiring, the goals that they had, the things that we wanted them to do in the business. Again, I'll reiterate that thing, it's bespoke and it needs to be individualized in my opinion. The result of doing this was that we got to a place where senior engineers joining the team were actually able to ship to production on their first day, which I was quite proud of. And that meant that we'd, I think, improved a lot of our processes. So by going through this exercise of getting good at onboarding, we got better at engineering, generally speaking. And so I'll talk about some of the positives, some of the things that came out of that in a little bit. On the point of the individual, one of the important things I think about establishing this and having this goal that somebody could reach, mapping out the process and eliminating some of the tedium that you may have encountered in other places in the past. Things like the first pull request from a new joiner was not fixing a typo in a README. It wasn't ensuring port 5432 wasn't already bound when invoking Docker Compose. We'd worked that kind of stuff out. And in elevating the individual, they could have inspiring conversations with colleagues and contribute in substantial ways almost immediately. They were delivering meaningful changes that impacted the business in measurable ways. It also gave them confidence that the place where they'd be spending a considerable amount of time genuinely cared about them and wanted them to be productive, wanted them to be successful. Those values that we instilled in that onboarding process were then passed on to the rest of engineering's culture, and the standards that we established were maintained. We'd set those expectations, and it made a big difference to maintaining the quality and the experience for other people that joined in the future. I would say it was time well spent. So I've described in a little more than a few minutes something that took a whole lot longer than a few minutes to establish and required constant maintenance, constant improvement. But I think we can break that down. We can cover some of the techniques, some of the results that I think are worthy for further consideration. And hopefully you'll see that some of these techniques that led to good onboarding processes actually end up improving the wider organization, may already be something that you're already doing, and can form a good part of getting people up to speed and productive and generally happy. So culture, I mentioned this engineering culture idea. If you don't define your culture, it doesn't mean you don't have one. It just means it's ad hoc. It just means it's not defined, and it will go wherever it might fancy. So codifying your principles and values helps to communicate the social contract that exists within your organization. Things like touch points between different teams, what should go into the description on a pull request, what amount of detail of user research, of specification, design work should be included in a feature before it gets implemented, who signs off on a merge or a deployment, who can veto shipping something to customers. These are all things that maybe worked out, maybe you know the answer to that, but if somebody brand new coming to your organization has that question, where would they find the answer? Some companies use things like handbooks to solve this problem. It might be something they send out to new joiners that will document some of these aspects. Something as simple as a Google Doc can be a good place to start. And frankly, that's how I've done a lot of this in the past. I create a Google Doc, share it with the team, and jot some of these things down and bullet points. And it's better than nothing. It's not as fancy as a beautifully typeset, fantastically designed PDF, or maybe even a printed book that gets sent out to you with a box of swag. But it's a good step in the right direction to codify some of that stuff and make those expectations clear. The question of who's responsible for what? Who should you talk to about a particular customer, a particular feature you're working on? If a new joiner can meet everyone involved in completing that overarching goal on their first day or within their first week, they're granted a degree of autonomy to affect change. That's a big deal in your first week. It's extremely empowering. It's extremely fulfilling and rewarding, as opposed to being perhaps quite demoralized by not being able to demonstrate just how good you are, not being able to solve a problem or interact or perform in a way that your other colleagues are doing every single day. So it's something to think about getting right. Documentation can help. Org charts might be up to date. Most of the charts I've encountered typically aren't. And even if they are up to date, they barely cover the responsibilities and capabilities of your colleagues. I think there's potentially a SaaS offering here somewhere that no one's yet quite built to map out these sorts of outputs from managing projects and managing feature development. If you're interested in developing that, give me a shout. I'd be happy to have a chat. But this is something that typically will come about through ad hoc conversations. You need to be able to talk to people. You need to be able to reach people in the organization who have some of this institutional knowledge that almost certainly will never be documented. That's where things like the buddy system come in. You've probably heard of this. This isn't anything particularly new. But having a buddy available, having a dedicated person can be extremely handy, extremely empowering. So somebody who knows the players, knows the game, and more importantly is incentivized to help this person. That might mean, probably certainly means carving out time and not being able to help elsewhere while that person is buddying up. But that allocation of time will pay dividends. You will get that other person up to speed. It will give them a point of contact to answer those questions that are otherwise unanswerable. And by that, I mean stuff like, I don't know, a good example might be sharing some of the values within the organization that aren't documented, some of the practices that aren't documented, maybe because you haven't got time, because you're very early stage in the business. You're not going to write down something like, James's dog has just passed away in a Google Doc and share that with everybody. But maybe your buddy is aware of that because they already have that connection with people and communicate that so-and-so is a little bit down at the moment. Those sorts of conversations typically need to happen in more of a sort of face-to-face setting, one-to-ones and things like that. So a buddy, having somebody that you can talk to navigate some of this is valuable, not just in terms of understanding the code, understanding feature development, understanding customers. There's a lot more information that people need to really succeed when they're joining an organization. If you're trying to deal with the code, the knowledge sharing, the process of deployment, pair programming is a good way of dealing with that. It's a good way of bringing people together, and I don't want to say sharing the pain. Maybe your code and everything else is very well organized and a pleasure to work with. But having somebody that is more familiar and can do that knowledge sharing with you can be extremely valuable. I've talked about documentation. I could talk about documentation for hours. Documenting the people and the responsibilities within the company by capturing and sharing information is obviously hugely empowering. But there are tools out there that can help with some of this stuff. I use something called Guru, which would integrate with Slack and turn threads that we were creating into long-lived FAQs so that answers were no longer lost in the infinite stream of countless channels. Executable documentation, in my opinion, is even better. I'm not talking about Cucumber and behavior-driven development, although I did do that for quite a few years. I'm referring to scripts that codify tasks like updating several repositories or copying data between environments. I've often been surprised by how many individuals have their own little bag of scripts to automate things and aren't sharing those. How often maybe senior people who are more experienced on one part of the stack have tools and technologies that aren't being shared with people elsewhere in the business. That happens quite often between back-end and front-end. The front-end people have a lot of knowledge about how to do front-end specific things that the back-end people don't have. And it maybe just lives on someone's machine, or they've put it in Notion or somewhere else. bringing that together and tidying that up, maybe through tools, maybe through process, maybe through culture, can go a long way to helping with those onboarding processes, but also helping the organization more widely. When you find yourself invoking the AWS command line, I don't know if you've done this, I've done this in the past, maybe you stick some of that code into something like an org file. Org mode allows you to capture the output, capture the command that's being executed. You can write documentation around it to explain why you're doing things the way that you are. Every time I have to buy a domain name through Route 53 using the command line, I have to go and look at the help. I can't remember, it's got to be in a specific region and it needs this and it needs that and whatever else. It got to the point where I thought, I'll just write it down. I'll put it in an executable format. And then the next time somebody needs to come in and buy a domain name, instead of it taking them 5-10 minutes, maybe it takes them 15 seconds. And my time investment was relatively low. I knew the technology, I knew the tools. If you're new to this stuff, then maybe there needs to be an investment in setting something like that up. But there are some open source tools out there. I know Spotify have built something to help with some of this codification of documentation. And there are some good frameworks around how to create and structure this information to make it as accessible as possible. Diataxis is a big one that's worth looking at if you want to double down on leveling up your documentation. The key thing here, I think, is to think about how you make it easier for the next person. That's what we're really talking about. How do you leave things better than you found them? This is something I love to see instilled in company culture, and this is something that I've seen make us much, much more efficient and much, much more productive. Extending documentation, I'm sure some of you are already thinking, well, I could just automate that, right? There's a famous XKCD with the graph of diminishing returns when you try to automate something. That is very real. I wouldn't probably automate something if I'm only going to do it once. If I've done it 3 times, then I might start thinking about automating it. If I imagine I'm going to do it 3 times, probably wouldn't automate it just yet. The expense potentially in trying to automate things that might just be easier going into a little file somewhere or a little script somewhere is something to be acutely aware of. I think a number of us are probably problem solvers and tinkerers and hackers, and it can be like crack, right? That dopamine hit of working on these things. Just something to be aware of if you're addicted to stuff like that, like I am. I can't obviously not mention things like Terraform and infrastructure as code. I've gotten a lot of value out of combining executable documentation with Terraform in the past. Codifying those sorts of unknowns is a fantastic way of communicating how things work, communicating what exists. The fear, AWS being this sort of black box of uncapped expense. Well, now it's a well-versioned, repeatable, well-documented uncapped expense, which is a little bit more comforting. If it's automated, you might not need to include it in onboarding at all. This is one of the things that I found, that backend engineers, for example, won't need to know a huge amount about infrastructure if they've got Terraform and they can just go in and copy and paste the module. There is a little bit of learning there, but you can build some tools, you can build some process to make that a less painful experience than maybe having to come in and create all of the IAM roles, create all of the virtual private networks and various other resources that are required to collect all of these sort of Lego pieces together to be able to service web requests or connect WebSockets, whatever it might be that you're doing on AWS. I guess mining crypto and creating large language models at the moment. Collaboration, that's a big one. For some hires, collaboration during the onboarding process is definitely worth considering. Sorry, not during, to design the onboarding process. I've seen this work extremely well with senior engineers, heads of teams and executives. Rather than going the prescriptive route and telling somebody what it is they should do when they join the company, drafting a 30, 60, 90-day plan with a starter for 10 that you put out there with some of the goals and the aspirations that you have as a company, maybe some of the things that you've already discussed during the interview process, codified, written up, and then asking for a bit of back and forth. What do you need from the business to support you? What can we do to maximize your success? The appreciative inquiry approach that I alluded to earlier uses a similar kind of idea to this sort of outcomes goal-orientated approach to reaching consensus, reaching some change, reaching some destination. I'd highly recommend something like a 30, 60, 90-day plan. It's also something you can use within the wider organization. We did this with a head of product that I introduced to a company a little while ago. And we were able to tell people within engineering, within marketing, within sales that these are the things that product is working on. These are our priorities. These are the things that we can commit to. It gave them a visibility into another department, another team that they otherwise might have considered to be a little bit obtuse, a little bit hard to understand, hard to predict. So I could talk about this all day, but I think it would be good to maybe open up to a bit more of an open discussion. So I'd like to conclude with a quick summary. There are other techniques, tools, and ideas you can incorporate into your process of socialization. I've talked about a couple that have worked for me and alluded to some of these dimensions that I think are worth thinking about when you're designing an onboarding process. If you get this stuff right, you can use it not just when adding new people to your company, but when you move people between teams. Change in this world is inevitable. The arrow of time is going to keep driving us forward, and we will continue furiously building and manipulating the world in front of us, trying to create newer and better things by standing on the shoulders of giants who've come before us. Once you realize that, once you embrace that idea, it's inevitable that you have to educate yourself. You have to learn new things. You have to be willing to move with the times. And I consider onboarding, socialization as something that's ongoing. It's continuous, just like our learning. You'll experience it many, many times. And I think anytime you approach a new problem, there is some amount of onboarding that's necessary, some amount of socialization that's required. And getting these things right, getting these processes in place, getting these facilities and techniques set up makes a big difference to how quickly you can react, how empowered your people are, how capable they are. So for me, it's a very important thing to invest time in, and pays dividends when you do get it right. So to continue with the conclusion, a well thought out process for training people is hugely valuable in rapidly changing knowledge-based work. I'd like to finish with 3 key takeaways before moving to the open discussion format I just mentioned. These 3 takeaways, I think, transcend tactics. The first is to make sure that at the end of onboarding, the individual has the relationships they need to succeed and that they can do purposeful work. These are a couple of the core tenets of what makes people happy. If you have relationships and if you have purpose, you'll generally feel better about your world. And if you feel better about your world, you'll be able to do better work. So getting those relationships in place and making sure people are productive, are purposeful, is extremely important anytime you go through one of these processes with anyone. I always say this with any process, treat your process like you do your product. We iterate on our products. We carry out research with our users. We embody the heart of agile, this idea of collaborate, deliver, reflect, improve. It's a perpetual cycle of essentially the scientific method where we put something out, we observe the results, we update our learning, and then we iterate, we continue. Do that with a process like this, and you'll continuously improve it. You'll see much better results. It is a learning opportunity. You will make mistakes. I made mistakes. Learn from those mistakes. Don't make the same mistakes twice, and you will get a better and better process, which will be more and more rewarding and something you can be more and more proud of. So always treat your processes like you do your process. Iterate, collaborate, deliver, reflect, improve. And the third and final key takeaway I'd like to share. Don't forget that you're dealing with people. We talked about institutionalized versus individualized processes. The institution has an investment. There is something that we want to get out of these people that we are employing, that we are contracting. But at the end of the day, in my opinion at least, people are more important than profit. People come first. And when we're designing these processes, we're creating environments that people have to live in. So be kind, be patient, and wherever possible, assume the best. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening. I'd welcome any questions you might have and be very happy to open this up to a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. We have one question already from, unfortunately, it's not a filled out username. You have mentioned a lot of useful tools. Can we get a list?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if I can reel them all off right now. I mentioned Guru. Guru is a tool that you can find in the Slack marketplace. I think they do more than just Slack now. The reason we use that is because Slack became a knowledge repository for us, a silo of information, and it was very difficult finding that information. We didn't really have an index, and there were workflows and processes that we needed to support that. So I think it was getguru.com. It was the domain name. That was a really good one that helped us. I talked about Terraform. Terraform was a big one. I don't know if these are dirty words anymore, but we were using Ruby on Rails back then. We were using Heroku. They've maybe fallen out of favor slightly. The important thing there was that we were using tools that were well understood. We didn't deviate from well-trodden paths where we didn't need to. We were innovating in certain areas. We had data processing pipelines that we'd built ourselves that needed to be highly bespoke. But if we were building a web application, we didn't go and build a framework ourselves. We used an off-the-shelf tool. That meant when people joined the company, they already had familiarity with this stuff. They could go out and Google for answers. They had access to Stack Overflow and things like that. So we were very deliberate in our choice of tools and technologies that we used, and used that sort of tech radar type approach to evaluate and bring things closer to ultimately being approved and being part of our repertoire. So I can follow up maybe later with a bulleted list in Slack with a few more specific recommendations.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. I'll also, for people that aren't in Slack, once that is in Slack, I'll send an email to attendees if you opted in for that, and to make sure that you guys get that list as well.
Yeah, if you're not in Slack, get in Slack. We're both in Slack, and you can talk to us as much as you like. So no excuses, get involved.
And occasionally James will also put puppy pictures up, which is also
yes, occasionally, yeah.
to join Slack. Oh, we have another question here from Yale. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Could briefly explain, how do you know your onboarding process is successful?
There are a couple of... So the first thing I would say is ask. Right, the point of onboarding, the point of socialization is to take somebody and prepare them for integrating with the team, make them productive within a tribe. If people are productive, if people are able to do their jobs effectively, if people are forming their relationships, if you've chosen some overarching goal, our goal of shipping something to production on the first day, you can measure some of that stuff. You can see that you're hitting those targets. And if you're not, you can start to try to understand why not. That third key takeaway of being kind, of assuming the best, it might not be the person being onboarded that's the problem. It could be that your onboarding process is just a bit rubbish. So look at the process first rather than looking at the people, and think about ways maybe you could improve that. But I think, again, I'm going to have to give that cop-out answer of it depends. It depends on your process. You can quantify some of this stuff. Some of it you can't quantify. For the things you can't quantify, a conversation can go a long way. Net promoter scores and things like that people will mention, but I find if you ask people, how did your first week go? Did you encounter any problems? Are there some ways we can improve that? Do a little bit of a retrospective. You'll get a good idea. You'll get good feedback from people around maybe some of the stumbling points, some of the things that could have gone better. I wouldn't worry too much about over quantifying, and trying to have like a graph with a line that's always kind of going up. Some of these things aren't really quantifiable, in my opinion. So if people join, they do their job well, they're reasonably happy, I would say you've done a pretty good job.
I can imagine it, because people are individuals. So I can imagine that your onboarding process with partnering buddies could work 9 out of 10 times, but it could be just one person just doesn't quite click with their buddy or whatever like that. So yeah,
absolutely.
Like open communication's really important, and having that open feedback channel is a must.
Absolutely. And that some people don't always gel. Some people are introverts. Some people don't want to get on a call and have a video call with someone they've never met before and have a conversation and open up to them. So being respectful of, as you were saying, the fact that people are individuals and treating them as such is quite important. The buddy system, I've not yet encountered somebody who didn't like having someone they could go and chat to. I've heard people say they didn't feel comfortable asking. They felt like they were imposing. So that was something that I've had to navigate in the past. And the other issue is I've had people say, I don't have time. I'm being expected to go to all these meetings. I've got clients that are expecting this, that, and whatever of me, and I don't feel I have the time to be able to properly support this person. So there are definitely some challenges with getting that right, and those are the two sort of major stumbling blocks that I've encountered.
But we have a follow-up question from Yale. Depending on the organization side and the onboarded person's seniority, role, project, etc., should the onboarding timeline might be variable? Would you advise to clutter them somehow?
It's a good question. One of these dimensions around the fixed or variable timelines that I briefly touched on, we can go into a bit more detail. Again, it depends. So there are some onboarding processes that require a hard deadline. Those are things like health and safety, first aid type training, compliance. I've worked in organizations where we had things like the Official Secrets Act. You had to sign certain paperwork before you got access to certain things. In those instances, there's no negotiation. You have to have a fixed timeline. Another motivation that you alluded to in the question is wanting a little sense of pressure, a little bit of a stretch goal. So sometimes saying, let's have something done by a certain point in time can be good towards motivation. I've used 30, 60, 90-day plans for that in the past, where we've made a commitment and communicated that openly to the rest of the company. That so in this example with product, I think we said within the first 30 days we were going to revamp the product process and unify work streams across back end and front end. I think by the 60th day we were talking about having cross-functional teams in place. I can't remember what the 90-day one was, but we did pick timelines and we collaborated on that. That was important. I think if we'd have just gone to this new person and said, right, you're going to do this by the end of your 30 days, you're going to do that by the end of your 60 days, wouldn't have been a very nice way to start. But by setting those deadlines, it did give us a milestone. It did give us something to sprint towards, if you'll pardon the metaphor. And it gave us a way to commit something to the wider business, which was actually very important in this situation because people were craving change. People wanted to see improvement going on. So we needed to communicate something. If you're dealing with external customers, clients, if you have deadlines to hit, if you're doing a massive release with Gucci that you weren't told about until like 2 months before it's supposed to happen, and you need to hire some designer to do all the Gucci assets, there may be a deadline coming from outside that you don't really have any option to negotiate on, which I have obviously personally encountered. So again, it depends. There are benefits to imposing those constraints. There are requirements sometimes to impose them. I would just be cognizant of the impact that has, and making sure that people are in a good place to be able to deliver on those targets.
Brill. What do you think of the idea of having available recorded sessions of meetings that don't happen often, so new joiners don't have to wait? We experimented with it and feedback was vague. Mixed
feelings. So when we talked about the sort of group onboarding and the individual onboarding, if you're in a large organization that's onboarding hundreds of people, you have that convergence of needs. You need to show the same content, you need to make the same speeches. You're going to inevitably start thinking, this is wasteful. Can I record this and just give it to somebody? Recording a video and giving it to somebody does a couple of things. For me, it sets up a dynamic that says your time isn't worth as much as mine. Whether that's intentional or not, I think that's ultimately the message that's coming across, that I'm going to record a video and you're going to sit there and watch it. I'm not going to take the time to actually have the conversation with you. For me, and this is probably me personally, I don't particularly like that. I would rather have the conversation with somebody. I'd rather have it in text so I can just quickly read it, because a video, it might take half an hour to get through, whereas if you send it to me in text, I might be able to get through 5-10 minutes. So my preference is for the individual process wherever possible. If that isn't feasible, then you may have to make some of these compromises, right? We do have to be pragmatic at the end of the day. The feedback being vague is probably, I remember having videos that I had to watch. They were on sort of anti-bribery regulations, telling me that if somebody offers me a hotel room, I can't accept that. But if they offer me a drink at the bar, that's fine. This sort of stuff, and you just feel a little bit sort of patronized, and you're having to sit through this. And what you really want to be doing is meeting people and building relationships and demonstrating your capabilities and having an impact. So if you do have those sorts of videos, if they're training materials, learning materials, it might be something that somebody values and wants to pick up at some point. But I think if you imagine your first week at a new company being watch 3 hours of videos, that's what we're going to have you do. I don't know. I wouldn't enjoy that personally. I'd rather be getting stuck in, meeting people, having an impact. So this is my opinion. I think if you're getting vague feedback, it might be an idea to talk to some of those people in more detail to get more structured feedback to decide what you want to do with that going forwards. Maybe I'm being a little bit cynical, but again, pragmatism is the word, right? It might be that you have to do some of this stuff. Maybe you just get through it and we'll get stuck in. I'd be curious to see the videos. And if you want to send them my way, I'd be very happy to review them.
I think it's one of those things, like back to talking about how people are individuals. I think if you've got core information like parts of the handbook and you provide saying, would you rather have it in a video or in the written format? I think depending on how people learn and process information, that could be useful. But I think if it's an important enough meeting to be regular, I think it's always worth just waiting for it when the next occurrence comes around, because you miss a lot of context from going into video. And even though you do see it real time, you are missing that in the room feel. So you still don't quite get what actually the dynamic is like and how the natural flow of the meeting happens anyway.
There is evidence that shows people get more out of a question and answer format when you want to disseminate information to them, where they can challenge and expand their knowledge and make sure there are no gaps. And you can't do that with a video. So if it's highly prescriptive, if it's how to turn the lights off in the office when you leave in the evening, there probably isn't a question, right? The switch is here and you do whatever else. If it's how to talk to customers, that kind of a conversation, I think you might have some questions. You might want to go into a bit more detail. And I think that would be where I'd start thinking about differentiating. Is there value in somebody being able to probe and go deeper and get more out of it? If it's paint by numbers, then something more static might work.
I certainly wouldn't mind some of the huge company policy handbooks that you told you have to read and then sign, being able to have an audibly file of that, so I can just listen to it on 2 times speed, get through it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a fantastic idea.
That would be fantastic, just to have that, because you could listen to it whilst you're doing all the login processes and picking your passwords for all the new systems.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a new thing to add to onboarding processes.
Well, exactly, and this is why having those conversations with people that are going through the onboarding processes is extremely important. Book that in at the end and get the feedback, because great ideas like that will come up, and maybe digitizing some of those PDFs and doing an audiobook isn't that much effort, and it could be extremely well received. So I love the idea. Very smart.
So this is from Mark. Do you separate onboarding from the interview process? I'm all about complete E2E experiences, but curious why you would split.
I have seen and started onboarding before people's first day at the company. And I didn't like doing it myself, because until you start at the company, I'm not paying you for your time. And me inviting you to something like a Slack work group and expecting you to kind of come in and talk to people just didn't really sit too well with me. I think that's based on my relationship with work and my sort of political ideology. For me, this end-to-end idea, there is only one experience that somebody is having. Right? The human being doesn't delineate their experience in terms of interview, onboarding, productivity. It's a journey they're going on. So in that sense, onboarding does start from the very moment you meet them. You are starting to feel somebody out. You're starting to try to identify their strengths and their weaknesses. You're trying to identify whether they're a good fit as a part of the business, where there may be gaps in the knowledge. You'll start sharing information with them potentially about the technologies and the process and the culture. So whether it's intentional or not, you're already starting to train them. You're already starting to expose them to some of this information. Once they start on their first day, the interview arguably isn't over, because they're probably in a probation period. So you're still kind of interviewing them. If they really got something, then they might not get past the 3-6 month probation period. So it's an interesting question. I don't know. I think we can delineate when we're representing the stuff in a document or a process, but the lines are blurred a little bit. I think the onboarding process does kind of start when you're interviewing. I think the interviewing process doesn't really stop until somebody's really settled into the company. And my opinion of onboarding, I don't know that I like the term onboarding. I think I prefer socialization. I think we're always sort of socializing. We're always updating our thinking. So no, it's an interesting observation. Yeah, I don't know that there is a sort of clear step from one to the other. I hope that answers your question. I hope that's what you were getting to.
I could see the lines of onboarding or socialization blurring a bit if, say, this is coming from a community career side of things. If they have an event saying, you know, we don't want you to help manage the event or anything, but we've got this event coming up between, you know, where you've signed the contract and your start date. We'd love for you to come and just have a pint post and see what it's like, and making it's kind of is an onboarding, but I'm not fully joined yet. So it's quite I can see where there are sort of grey areas of when's appropriate to reach out and be like, hey, just why don't you come along and join us for this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's we're developing a relationship, we're building a relationship, and we talk about breaking that down into interview, onboarding, but it really is one relationship. It's one meeting of minds, one opportunity to better understand one another and work out sort of social contracts, how we interact, how we communicate. I like the going for drinks thing is something that I've seen happen quite often, right? When you're interviewing somebody before they start, you'd say, we'll go grab a beer. I don't drink anymore, so I probably wouldn't be invited to do that. But you know, in my 20s, in startup times, that was how we socialized. It was going to the pub. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That socialization, that sort of relationship building thing would typically start before. I talked about Slack, right? You can see I've just been ruined by a sort of remote working and COVID. But no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, we used to do just that.
We've got a few minutes left. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to whack it in. Yeah, I think especially for talking about socialization, I think for juniors, you know, fresh grads that are just coming out of uni and going into their first job, I think that's so important because they don't know much about the corporate world, you know, in terms of they might have done internships and stuff like that, but the mindset's very, very different. I'm speaking about this because my younger brother's just gone through this. So, and I think just being able to have that space where they can see that, you know, that they're not scary people. Like they may be your manager and what have you, but they're just human. You can go to them if you have questions and things like that. And I think being in a cafe or pub scenario before that first day just makes it a bit easier, and I think it breaks the ice and saves face a bit, other than first seeing people when you walk in the doors for the first time officially.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of that informality. You know, the first time you see a figure of authority drunk dancing on a table, it paints them in a very different light.
Yeah, you're just reminded, like, oh no, yeah, it's okay if I need to have a question on this thing that seems simple, that actually, you know, they're not gonna they
have fun too, and yeah, and you can find out about common interests outside of work. It's a great opportunity to bond. I think that the corporate world is an idiosyncratic place. I'm acutely aware of it. The nonsense that comes out of my mouth, social contracts and social collateral and all this jargon that teenage me would have just wanted to punch me in the face for using. But you become indoctrinated, right? You become socialized. I've been socialized. I've been trained to behave in these ways and to use this kind of language over the years and years and years that I've been exposed to it. So it does work, right? We do get onboarded, whether we maybe like it or not.
Maybe some articles in Wittgenstein to new joiners, and to tell them how easily they are going to be, especially new joiners are going to be indoctrinated into corporate speak. Might be.
I was very careful with my choice of words. I didn't want to say indoctrinate. I didn't use probs. I was very careful. I hope it didn't slip of the tongue.
Bro, any other questions? No worries if you because I'm like this all the time. Once I've as soon as something finishes, I'm like, oh, of course, I wanted to ask this. As Jim mentioned, we're both in the Slack channel, so please do come join us. I'll also be sharing some links of how you can connect with James or myself via email or LinkedIn or however you prefer. Next week, we've actually got an in-person event. So after just speaking about meeting at the pub and everything, we've got one happening in London. This will be an informal networking event at Wapping Tavern. Come with an open mind to network with like-minded CTOs in a relaxed social setting and chat about the important tech topics and trends in an interactive evening, complete with nibbles and refreshments. The Wapping Tavern also has things like shuffleboard and arcade games and all sorts. So it should be quite a fun evening. I'll be posting the event page in the chat, and I hope to see you there. I'm also thrilled to announce that 60% of tickets for CTO CraftCon have already been sold, and we're well on our way to a sellout event. Early bird tickets will be available for a few more weeks or until the allocation runs out, so you shouldn't miss that opportunity. I'll be posting the link as well, so please do nab that. Let me just post everything now. So that you can check out those links. Oh, we have one more question just before I sign off. Just saying thank you for sharing your experience, James. Yeah, I think Vida, it seems that the question got cut off halfway through. So I think it's to do with documentation. So if you have any additional documentation apart from the list, James, if you could just share that in Slack, that would be really useful.
Yeah, I'll happily mention diataxis and things like that. I'll share some links later.
Brill. Well, have a great weekend and hope to see a few of you next week in person. See you.
Have a good one, everyone. Bye-bye.